welcome to today's Newcastle University Knowledge Seminar Series. My name is Andrea Henderson and I'm Head of Engagement at Newcastle University. I just want to say this is our fourth webinar version of this series. So we think we've got all of our technical glitches ironed out, but in case we have any, then please bear with us. You'll see on the holding side at the beginning, we just ask if people could perhaps keep their videos off and their microphones muted. This just helps us to focus on what our speaker is saying. I'd like to also give a thanks to Holly and Carl. I think you have all received emails from Holly organising the seminar today, and Holly has moved our programme seamlessly online, so we've been able to do the last 4 webinars, which has been great. Yeah, just make sure we have our videos and microphones off, which is great. So I just want to give you a little bit of background as to what the KESS is. My eyes will move along. So Newcastle University Knowledge Exchange Seminar Series, or actually now webinar series, aims to promote evidence-based policy making by enabling researchers to present their findings to decision makers. This was developed by Professor Sally Shortall with colleagues at Queen's University Belfast. Sally is now an academic with us in Newcastle University in our Centre for Rural Economy, and I believe Sally may be on the call today, so hi Sally. The idea of the KESS is that this is a partnership between the university, 5 local authorities and the North East LEP and the Chamber of Commerce. And the idea is that we go to partners and say, what are the big issues for you in the policy making arena? They come up with a list of hot topics and we put these to the academic community. And at that point, academics respond depending on where they are within their project and their findings, and the result of which is one of these sessions. So last year, there were 3 seminars delivered, and this year we've had 2 seminars face-to-face, and this is the 4th, as I say, online webinar that we've had. Also, just to let you know, this is actually the last in our current programme, but we're currently working with our partners to find out what are the topics, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic, and how we can respond to those. So the programme will be shaping it for next year, and we can share details via our website and our Twitter. Just to say that this session is being recorded so that anyone who's been unable to join us today can listen again later. So just to make you aware of that. Today's speaker is Professor Alison Stenning from our School of Geography, Politics and Sociology. And Alison's going to be sharing with us the findings of her research around the playing out model and promoting community and belonging through play. Alison's talk will last around 30 to 40 minutes, and following this there will be a Q&A session. So just at any point throughout Alison's talk, if you think of any questions you'd like to ask, if you could use the chat functionality, and if you type those in there, Holly-Ann will be able to collate those and we'll put those to Alison at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd just like to hand over to Alison. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'll try now to share my screen. Oops. I hope that's working for everyone. And now I realise that I probably can't launch the polls. So yeah, I'm back, hopefully, to launch a poll just to start the seminar. So you'll see on your screen, hopefully, 4 short questions, 2 of which don't have any kind of immediate answers, but if you can answer the poll that appears on your screen. Almost all of you voting there. Okay, and so just to quickly share the results of that, 92% of you remember playing out in your streets as a child. Just 2 of you don't remember playing out on the street as a child. Our next question, just asking you to reflect a little bit on how your streets have felt over the last few weeks, even months. again, the vast majority of you recognising some differences on your street. Obviously, I'm not asking there kind of what kinds of differences you felt on your street, so we might be able to reflect on that a bit more towards the end of today's session. And then two more in which I'm asking you for responses to questions from a 2018 survey. In a 2018 survey, respondents were asked how they viewed their neighbours. What proportion viewed their neighbours as strangers? Okay, and to share the results of that one, you were right. 68% of respondents viewed their neighbours as strangers. It's interesting that the two highest scoring there are the 68 and 77%. So you will recognise that it's common for neighbours not to know each other. And the last question, in a 2018 survey, how many respondents, the same survey, didn't know the names of the children next door? And I just need to launch that one. And again, you got it right. So 51, in fact, half of you got it right, just the largest single category. 51% of respondents to the survey didn't know the names of the children who lived next door. So I'll close that poll down and share my screen again. Hopefully that's all now clear. So thank you very much for signing up and attending. I think there's a range of different attendees today. There's some council officers, there's some practitioners, and there's some academics here. Hopefully we'll connect to a range of interests in what I'm going to talk about today. It's worth saying that I agreed to do this seminar when it would have been a seminar before the COVID crisis. And when I expected that I would be at the point when I'd done a fair amount of fieldwork on an ongoing project at the moment. Clearly, I haven't been doing that fieldwork, both because I can't travel to do the fieldwork, but also because playing out sessions haven't been happening over the last few months. So I'm going to talk about some previous research and some kind of early and kind of speculative ideas and responses from some ongoing research, and I'll explain a bit more about that as I go along. So those were the quiz answers of the ones obviously that had kind of factual responses. I think in many ways kind of remarkable responses, but obviously ones which reflect your own experiences of your streets and your neighbours. I'm going to be talking then primarily today about the playing out model. So there are all sorts of different ways obviously in which children play out on their streets. They're not always in organised sessions as the playing out model is framed. Playing out is a model which was created in 2009 by a group of parents, particularly mothers in Bristol. Since 2009, it's grown to incorporate over 1,000 streets in more than 80 local authorities. At its heart, the playing out model is a resident-led, bottom-up model for regular temporary closures of residential streets, allowing neighbours to play and to meet in a car-free environment, a temporarily car-free environment. Closures usually last between 2 and 3 hours, take place fortnightly or monthly, occasionally weekly, often on a Sunday, but sometimes also after school. Local councils approve applications, but in most instances, residents themselves establish the closures using road close signs, often attached to wheelie bins, stewarded by volunteers from the street. Residents are allowed to drive in and out of the street while it's closed, but must do so at a walking pace and guided by a steward. Through traffic's not permitted and will be diverted. Parents or carers must be present to be responsible for their own children unless they're of an age where they can safely and independently play out by themselves. And play is predominantly child-led and tends to involve bikes, scooters, balls, chalks, running, and all sorts of other imaginative, physical and exploratory play. As I've suggested, the model was created in 2009. It now involves over 1,000 street communities in more than 80 local authorities across the UK, and increasingly also in an international context in Australia, in Taiwan, in the United States, in Canada, in Romania, and a whole variety of other countries beyond. In the UK, it's estimated that it draws in around 30,000 children and 15,000 adults. And the model has been recognised increasingly by national government or community sporting organisations valuing the creation of space for play, or the recreation of space for play, on our doorsteps. In the words of Michael Ellis, the Minister of State for Transport, just last year, play streets offer wonderful opportunities, not merely for children, but for families and communities. So this research, briefing reflects on 3 research projects that I've been involved in since 2016 onwards. The first was a preliminary and small scale project focused here in North Tyneside. I say here, that's where I am at the moment, which involved talking to the people on their streets who were organising playing out in North Tyneside, where we've had an active scheme since 2015. I'm also going to be referring, and this will form a large chunk of this briefing, to a collaborative project working with Playing Out, which looked at the experience of street play, play streets playing out. I'll use the 3 phrases interchangeably, and alleviating loneliness and building connections. And that was funded here by Newcastle University Social Justice Research Fund, which incorporated interviews with street organisers and activators, cascaded to their neighbours, and interviews with active street play participants from 8 local authorities. The third, an ongoing project, asks how Playing Out shapes residents' attachments, material and emotional, to their streets and to the people on them. That study, this third study, began before the coronavirus crisis emerged, but is now kind of paused or reshaped in the context of that crisis. And I'll touch a bit about that towards the end of today's presentation. So there's various points in today's presentation where what I'm suggesting and what I'm talking about raises particular questions in the current crisis, and I'll flag those at key points, and I'll come back to talk about that a little bit more at the end. As I suggested, I'd hoped to be in the middle of fieldwork at this point, particularly focusing on this question of how place on streets shapes our attachments to our streets. And I'm not doing that at the moment, so I won't be able to reflect directly on that, but I'm going to try and pick up on some kind of early and speculative reflections on that based on my own experience, but on some other kind of sources as well. And I should also say, as some of you know, I'm also a Play Streets or Playing Out activist. I help to run Play Meet Street North Tyneside, which is a community voluntary group which works with North Tyneside Council to promote playing out across the borough. We currently have about 50, or normally have about 50 streets playing out across the borough, about 30 of those with monthly regular sessions. Playing out has kind of been the focus of quite a lot of research as it's grown as a phenomenon and a movement over the last 10 years. Playing Out and its collaborators have engaged in a whole variety of different kind of projects of different sizes and different focuses, and it's useful to kind of highlight some of those key impacts as context, if you like, for what else I'm going to say today. One piece of research drew attention to the fact that during Playing Out sessions, NO2 levels were 5 times lower than a normal afternoon. So there's clear kind of environmental and air pollution benefits from Playing Out sessions, creating effectively kind of short periods of traffic-free time on our streets. In terms of kind of physical activity and sport and play, on a Playing Out day, children are seen to be 3 to 5 times more active than they would on a normal day. So incorporating a Playing Out session in a school day or a weekend would see children to be 3 to 5 times more active than they would otherwise have been. And in a 2017 survey of Playing Out, the majority of respondents reported that their children had learned or improved skills, including riding a bike, scooting, roller skating, and skipping. That's many of the things that people do, that children do, and even adults do during a Playing Out session. And many also reported that their children learn about road safety during play sessions, that they're much more aware of roads and traffic and the choices and decisions we have to make as we use those. So it's clear that there are significant and diverse social, public health and environmental benefits to organising playing out sessions. And my focus for the remainder of the briefing will be on the benefits for communities and for belonging. Academic literature suggests that play is often the means through which children and adults make sense of their environments. Play is often the means through which children and adults learn to make sense of our environments. It encourages us to take notice and make connections to the people and places around us. Ongoing research and activism around play and community argues that children and their play are not separate from other aspects of community life. More people playing out more of the time in more places can improve community cohesion. And, oops, sorry, my camera's just falling back down here. Apologies there. Okay, hopefully that will stay still now. Yeah, so more people playing out more of the time in more places can improve community cohesion and strengthen intergenerational relationships. And these are sorts of ideas that I'm going to pick up and explore now as I go through some of the material from the research that we've been doing. As we might expect, many residents start to set up playing out sessions on their streets to give space to their children to play. But we can also see that the desire to meet their neighbours and build a community was often seen as just as important as that desire to create a space to play. So here we've got a couple of examples of respondents saying, because I want to foster a community that I want to live in that looks out for each other. I wanted to take part in something positive to bring some community cohesion to our street. A staggering 95% of respondents to our 2019 survey felt that they knew more people because of playing out sessions, that they knew more people on their street because of playing out sessions, and 71.7% felt that their children had made new friends. 86.7% felt that their streets felt friendlier and safer, and 91.7% felt they belonged more on their street. Of course, these are surveys carried out with participants engaged in street play, engaged in playing out on their streets, but it's quite clear and quite marked how much this has had an impact on their experiences of their street. Repeatedly, respondents drew attention to their experiences of real connections being created on streets as they started to play out. Names were attached to faces and then fleshed out with lives and with histories, such that streets became animated by the people living and connecting on them. So just a couple of examples here. Just once you get to know a couple of people, about a couple of stories about that person, suddenly they become a real person that you care about. Just the second that you know your neighbour's name, they become a person, don't they? They become somebody, yeah. New relationships between neighbours facilitated practical and diverse forms of help to be offered. We share lawnmowers, walk each other's dogs, put out each other's bins when away, check up on older residents if they haven't been seen for a while, unscrew each other's jam jars, lend each other tools, take in postal deliveries for each other, hand down toys and bicycles to younger children in the neighbourhood, go down into the neighbours' basements to look at fuse boxes when they're frightened too. And over again, respondents came up with these kinds of stories, these kinds of often small, often ordinary, and often taken for granted forms of help that they offered to support each other in a whole variety of different ways, from kind of playful things, from kind of necessary things, from issues around safety and health and care, and so many more. On most playing out streets, regular sessions were also complemented by online spaces such as Facebook and WhatsApp. In most instances, these grew out of the organisation of playing out sessions, but it often expanded well beyond their initial function and beyond the families that regularly played out. And one of the things that we've seen in recent weeks is that streets that played out, that already had existing Facebook and WhatsApp groups, were very quick to respond to the needs and demands of neighbourhoods in the context of the coronavirus crisis, organising and motivating each other to offer additional support to vulnerable neighbours, to neighbours that were living alone, and so on and so forth. On one street in our research, an estimated half of households have joined the Facebook group, as well as neighbours from adjoining streets. And in addition to playing out sessions, people put on, if they've got too much milk, if they want something like a ladder or something, or recommendations for tradesmen, that's there a lot. If somebody's been burgled or if they've seen someone looking a bit dodgy. Neighbours used Facebook and WhatsApp to discuss planning applications, arrange to lend and borrow equipment, and act as a kind of online neighbourhood watch. These spaces on the street and online also facilitated additional street and neighbourhood activities. More than a third of respondents reported that playing out had led them and their neighbours to get involved in other community activities such as gardening, litter picking, toy book plant and clothes swaps, and connecting to wider cycling, walking and better streets campaigns. Of course, not all neighbours are involved in playing out sessions. Most respondents acknowledge that there was a core of neighbours, largely made up of families with children under 10. It's what we might expect. But often these children didn't know each other when playing out started. School children increasingly, as we know, attend a number of different schools. It wasn't unusual in our research to find primary school children living on the same street, but attending up to 7 different schools. Resident children also vary considerably in age, meaning that there are opportunities to play with and connect to older and younger children on the street. We can see that in this quote here. They know loads more children on the street. They've made friends who go to different schools. They hang out at sessions in mixed age groups in a way that they don't normally. And we've seen other examples of that throughout the research. There's also some evidence that playing out on the immediate spaces of the street on their doorsteps is particularly accessible for children with disabilities and allows for children who may be educated at home, at special schools or an alternative provision to meet and play with their neighbours when they're being schooled perhaps at home, further away, bused to school and so on. A handful of respondents noted the relative absence of men, including fathers. One respondent picked up on the sense that mothers generally already had more local contacts, and that in this context playing out had been extremely important for her husband. And she went on to say, more importantly for me, my husband has got to know people in our street. He commutes to London and has little in the way of connection to our area. He could probably live anywhere. Now he's stewarded regularly with a variety of other people and knows and likes people that live near us. It's fantastic. So we can see some of the ways in which people who might have quite fragile and quite kind of minimal links to the community, even though they live within it, developing stronger connections through the organisation of playing out sessions. More generally, the potential to build friendships with other parents on the street was something highlighted by a number of respondents. Of those respondents who'd lived on their street for less than 2 years, all felt that playing out sessions had helped them integrate into the street rapidly, much quicker than they otherwise would have done. All had small children who they felt had benefited from playing out, and all appeared to have been integrated into the street's networks of support and friendship as much as long-standing residents. And we also had all sorts of stories and versions of and accounts of people who'd lived on the street for years, for 15, 20, 25 years, and only through playing out had started to meet their neighbours. So both those who were moving onto the street and trying to integrate rapidly, but also those who'd been on the street for a long period of time were benefiting from the new networks that were being created. 59% of respondents reported that adult neighbours without children do join in with playing out sessions, often taking on stewarding roles, so securing the closures and dealing with any cars that needed to be guided safely down the street or redirected. Many respondents gave examples of older neighbours who'd been regular and active supporters and participants. And there's just a couple of quotes here. The older women who live on the street in their 80s who were here when the houses were first built come out for tea and cake, and it's wonderful. We have an elderly couple who've never missed a session. And we have all sorts of evidence, again, not only of generally of adults without children being brought in and encouraged and enabled to participate on the street, but particularly those who were more vulnerable, who were living alone, and who were in need of additional support, and that support then begins to be offered through these networks. And often even for those, as I'll talk about in a bit later, those who weren't actively participating, but who were then increasingly aware of their neighbours and of the connections and relationships built during the street play sessions. When asked about barriers to participation, respondents suggested that playing out may be seen as something for children and for families, that neighbours are wary of coming out perhaps to meet strangers, that some are unaware of the events happening as a result of issues with communication, including social media, and especially in the context of cultural and/or language barriers, that some residents are housebound, ill, struggle with mobility, and so on. Some of these barriers are mediated by organisers actively door-knocking their neighbours and inviting them personally, by helping less mobile neighbours to come out and providing chairs for them, and by emphasising in all communication that all are welcome, and often offering tea and coffee and cakes alongside the opportunity to play and meet. Our social media not only serves the purpose of communicating dates and times, but increasingly also took on additional functions alongside and in between playing out sessions. The exclusion of those without easy access to social media was potentially aggravating. For a few, the issue of stigma and fear around adults without children was identified as a barrier to participation. Interviews queried whether adults, and especially men without children, would feel comfortable participating in child-oriented events, and if indeed neighbours would welcome their presence. Of course, some neighbours simply don't want to participate. As one respondent to the wider survey suggested, some people just don't want to be social, and that's fine. Some recognise that their neighbours might see playing out sessions as an unwelcome blurring of public and private boundaries and a kind of enforced neighbourliness. Interestingly though, non-participation doesn't necessarily mean exclusion from the wider networks and benefits of playing out sessions. In the small survey of non-participants that I carried out alongside some of this research, the majority felt that their neighbours, the majority felt that they knew their neighbours and had experienced a more general friendliness on their streets since playing out started, despite not participating. As one questionnaire respondent noted, just doing it for a while brings huge benefits to the whole street, whether everyone attends or not. For children, of course, playing on the street is the primary source of the connection made. Children who likely did not know each other previously play together, connect and start to develop friendships. Play is often the way too in which these connections are extended beyond sessions through play at school and play dates, and on some streets more independent autonomous playing out on quieter streets and on pavements and so on. But playing out also creates a space for adults too, whether that's play as we might understand children's play, or other forms such as gossip, banter and just hanging out. There are many examples of adults playing during playing out sessions, both with children and without, with scooters, with balls, with bubbles, with chalk and so on. Respondents highlighted particular examples where those perhaps reticent or are likely to join in were drawn out by the possibility of play. And this is one example here. There was one woman once who was just walking down the street, and I don't know for sure, she's quite self-contained, but she just started skipping, and I got into a chat with her, and that was lovely. And she started stewarding after that. It certainly helped, just the skipping. She couldn't resist, basically. She just thought, I just really want to have a go at that. And we saw a lot more of her after that. A number of respondents, both in questionnaire and in interview, gave examples of intergenerational conversations around play too. In addition to tea and cakes, one of the common ways in which organisers tempt older neighbours out is by encouraging them to share stories and practices of their childhood play, telling young children about the games they played, sometimes on the very same street, and showing them how to play. And some examples too, teenagers, often reluctant to join in playing out sessions, would show younger children how to kick a ball, would hold a skipping rope, or would help to balance a learner cyclist. Other adults without children were also drawn in on occasion to help fix bikes, mend punctures, provide play equipment, and in other ways facilitate play, overcoming their concerns that playing out isn't for them by helping out with specific play-related tasks. Of course, play might also be off-putting for some. The noise of children playing, for example, may dissuade some from coming out, even if they were otherwise tempted. Flying balls, water fights, scooters and bikes zooming past might also discourage or frighten off more vulnerable, less mobile neighbours, even if organisers do all they can to minimise these dangers. The playing out model itself also particularly facilitates adult connections. It always starts with a small number of adult neighbours who in most local authorities are required to consult with every affected neighbour. Many activists highlighted how this initial act of door knocking and consultation was quite literally and metaphorically the start of doors opening on their street. The playing out model also requires adults to be present and responsible for their children, and it relies on volunteer stewards to secure the road closed barriers. As we've seen, older adults and those without young children often offer to steward sessions. This encourages them to join, but also leaves parents to play with their children and with other adults. As well as at the closures at the end of the streets, parents often congregate around certain points on the street, hanging out with each other, watching their children from a distance. Most playing out streets organise frequent and regular sessions, weekly, monthly, fortnightly. This means that participating neighbours meet and play together regularly, much more than, for example, in one-off street parties. And this reinforces the potential for connections to be maintained and developed. The second strand, which I'm going to turn to now, is at the moment much more speculative. It's based on reflections on 5 years of activism and on observations on streets since 2016. It's a key focus of my ongoing research, but as I suggested, has been delayed by the coronavirus crisis. Here, the key argument is that spending time on streets not only creates opportunities for residents to get to know each other and to build community, but also to get to know the street space itself. The houses, the network of roads and back alleys, the green spaces, the trees, plants and wildlife, the views and perspectives, and indeed the textures, smells and sounds, whether natural or not. This enables, amongst other things, place attachment. I'll come back and talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but through the tactile, personal, embodied connections to their everyday environments, we see, I would argue, children and adults making stronger connections to the places in which they live. And place attachment is generally viewed, as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation suggests here, as having positive effects, helping to enrich people's lives with meanings, values and significance, contributing to people's mental health and well-being, and that these effects are felt not only at the individual level, but also at the scale of the community. So I'm just going to show you some images here of playing out sessions. Some of these photos are mine, some of these come from playing out, some of these come from other playing out activists. I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the ways in which we can see here children and adults connecting to their streets in new and diverse ways. So here, for example, we can see children of all ages and adults connecting quite literally to the very surfaces of their street, lying on them, sitting on them, touching them, feeling them, making their marks on them in a whole variety of different ways, by exploring themselves and their bodies on the street, by crawling around the streets, by sitting and playing on the street, by sharing and playing and drawing together on the street. So we can see here too people making marks on the street, and this is a common theme in quite a lot of the images that I'll show you. Chalk features very heavily, and the ways in which people make marks on the street, identify themselves on the street. You quite often see people naming the street, naming themselves as they chalk during playing out sessions, for example. So there's a kind of mark making going on during this process. We see children and adults experiencing their streets in all seasons and in all weathers. Most of us have tales of playing out in the rain, even if it's just grabbing kind of a half hour or an hour within a 3-hour session where the rain ceases a little bit. The snow obviously offers enormous opportunities for people to enjoy their streets in new ways. But we also, see neighbours experiencing their street through a whole variety of different kind of weathers, feeling the elements on their street in all different kinds of conditions, seeing the seasons change on the street, going through cycles of seasons on the street, looking forward to the warmer sessions, looking forward to the snowy sessions. So we can see the ways in which children and adults feel and kind of connect to the weather and the seasons on their streets. We can also see children and adults investigating and making the most of the length, the shape, the slope, the camber of their streets as they scoot, cycle, sledge and play on them. You can see here a whole variety of different ways in which children and adults learn about the different shapes of their streets, learn about the kind of the feel of their streets, both in terms of kind of the surface of those streets, but the movements that are possible on those streets, the vistas that are opened up on their streets from top to bottom and so on. I hear a number of stories of people not realising, for example, that their street sloped until their children learned to cycle along it, or until their children worked out that they could get a lot more speed up on a scooter one way than the other. And in one of these images, you can see children setting up racetracks for children, racetracks for cars down the street as well, bringing indoor toys outside and making the most of the space and shape and form of the street. But this also, as I suggested, opens up the vistas of the streets, allows people to see the views and perspectives of their streets, often together, shared with other children, with other adults, a clearer sense of what their street is and what surrounds their street, and what is possible to be seen and experienced from their street. We also see residents exploring and tending to the natural and green spaces of their street during and between playing out sessions. Here you can see a Play Street Grow Wild project. You can see small worlds invented and inserted into the shapes of trees and verges on the street, teddy bears, fairy doors, webs made of wool here, for example. And we can see sunflower growing, we can see planting in tree pits, for example. We can see mud potions being made from the ingredients of the street on a street wall, and we can see more explicit and deliberate planting on streets as well. So in this way, we can see residents in and between playing out sessions not only kind of supplementing and developing the green spaces on their street, but also exploring and investigating and creating kind of inventories of those streets as well. So identifying wildflowers and weeds, identifying street trees, connecting and valuing those street trees and wildflowers and weeds, but also exploring, for example, bugs and mini beasts. One of my daughter's favourite activities during our playing out sessions is going out with a magnifying glass and finding mini beasts on the street with her friends and exploring them in the middle of the street. We can also see people finding ways to sit and finding ways and spaces to sit and engage on the street, to connect to people during sessions on the street. As I've suggested, adults often find themselves sitting or standing in particular places on the street, finding walls to lean on. But we can also see children doing that. And sometimes it's not just about finding a space to engage, but finding a space to kind of be on the street with others. So a picture here of a child reading whilst sitting on a wall as other children on the street play. And noticing then the spaces and the heights and levels of the street in which we can kind of find different activities and different ways of engaging with the street and engaging with our neighbours. And to these we can add perhaps some other examples, finding the holes and bumps that make moving around the street more fun or more tricky, depending on your perspective and your mode of mobility. I'm losing track of my sheets here. We can find also examples of residents, young and old, identifying the history of the street through the ages of the houses, the street signs and the other features, drain covers, blue plaques, quirks of design, for example. Also exploring the shared and diverse histories of their street, quite often finding the fact that everyone's house looks the same but feels very different when you know and understand who lives in them and who calls those places home. And so we can see in a whole variety of different ways that how playing out facilitates these multi-level kind of multi-sensory engagements with our streets in a whole variety of different kind of momentary kind of feelings and experiences and practices. And it might appear that some of these moments are trivial, but an extensive literature on place attachment suggests that there's a real value in enabling children and adults to make these tactile, physical, personal and embodied connections to their everyday environments. The benefits accrue to both the individuals themselves, but also to the wider community, as I've suggested. In the specific context of this research, being able to play and spend time outdoors creates all kinds of potential for creative activities, which in turn offer adults and children the opportunity to express themselves. Children and adults who are able to connect playfully with their streets, to spend time on them in meaningful and social activities, and to have priority on them, will feel like the streets belong to them, that they have a rightful place on them. Feeling like they belong to the streets and the communities enables them in turn to feel confident and secure in reaching out to the world as they start school, build friendships and start to develop a sense of self, for example. Our street is the starting point for all our journeys, and a sense of belonging on our street can take us a long way. Opportunities for on-street playfulness open up space for connection too. When children and adults have the chance to be with each other and to build connections to their immediate environments, we see evidence that they also experience openness to contribute to their communities through other kinds of activities and commitments. And I gave some examples of that earlier on. Research suggests that those with a strong sense of place attachment are active in forging and maintaining community relations and engaging with others working and living locally. In particular, there's evidence that those who are intimately and intricately connected to the places in which they live are more likely to notice and care for their natural environments. Increasingly, research shows that just noticing nature, even urban nature, has real benefits for individual and community well-being. And my colleague Vicky Holden talked about this at a previous KESS seminar. And long-standing research suggests that those who are connected more to their everyday places demonstrate a stronger commitment to environmental stewardship, both in the present and in the future. If we're connected to the places in which we live as children, we seem to value connections to our communities and environments as we grow up and move to new places. I'm going to turn for the last few minutes then to think about how some of these issues resonate and quite literally kind of play out in the context of COVID-19 too. As many of you will know, all organised playing out sessions have been put on hold during the COVID-19 lockdown. They are kind of social gatherings involving more than a few people and strangers from different households. But nevertheless, we've seen a number of challenges and responsibilities emerging around play on streets in this context. Firstly, and perhaps most urgently, we've seen real concerns raised about the conditions for children's play. Play, and particularly outdoor play, are essential activities for children at times like this, so that they can make sense of and find some control in these confusing times. Outdoor play affords far greater opportunities for creative, boisterous and active play, such that outdoor spaces must be secured safely for children to play, particularly in a context of closed playgrounds, controlled parks, and of course the absence of school time and school space. This is especially true in large urban areas where there may be significant concentrations of overcrowded housing and or homes without access to outdoor space. We know that families with more limited and indoor and outdoor space tend to be poorer and from minority ethnic communities. So there are real social justice issues here too. In this context, enabling children and their families space to play with safe physical distance in the streets would be an important move for their physical and mental health and well-being. So this would mean looking at traffic and speeding and exploring possibilities for temporary or more permanent closures to through traffic. Secondly, I'd suggest we have a responsibility to reflect on what has been happening on our streets during the COVID-19 lockdown. The vast majority of you said that your streets felt very different over the last few weeks. So we need to think about this, and we need to think carefully about the role of streets and neighbour communities in the recovery. We've seen neighbours supporting each other through the crisis, with informal networks of care rapidly emerging in the early weeks of the crisis. We've seen these maintained and developed and complemented by playful and social acts, the painting of rainbows, teddy bear hunts, the clap for the NHS, for example, street Zumba and bingo sessions, and a whole variety of different kinds of activities. At the same time, until quite recently, we've seen traffic on our residential streets decline dramatically, rising numbers of pedestrians, cyclists and others using our streets while schools are closed and many are working from home or furloughed. Many have, paradoxically, in this context, enjoyed being able to use their streets more, revelled in the quiet, hearing birds, having conversations over garden walls, and so on. As local authorities are called upon to make significant changes to their road layouts to give space to cyclists and pedestrians, it's also incumbent upon them to consider safe access to street space for children and their families, not only for walking and cycling, but also to play and connect. And as the news has emerged over the last couple of days, that the vast majority of children will not be back in school until September at the earliest. This question of creating space for children and their families to play and socialise over the coming months throughout the summer seems to be all the more urgent. So just to conclude, play transforms neighbourhoods and residents' relationships with and within them. It's clear evidence across the board that that happens. Not a single street that we spoke to suggested that nothing had changed and nothing had changed for the better on their streets since they started playing out. The relationships enabled by play support communities' physical, social and emotional well-being. Through play, sense of community and belonging are strengthened, and these have both practical and meaningful consequences in neighbourhoods and beyond. And these issues and these concerns and these impacts are all the more important in the context of our collective recovery from COVID-19. And I'll leave it there and open for questions and discussion.
Hi everyone, I would firstly like to thank Alison for her presentation. It was really, really interesting. We're going to open the Q&A session now. So we have a few questions lined up, and if anyone has any more questions, if they could just put them in the chat box and I'll get to them. So our first question is, traditional playing out is an adult-free zone. What is the role of adults in this modern version? And then added to that is, perhaps I should have asked, what is the role of children?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think as much as is possible in the model as it works, the kind of commitment is to a child-led play idea. I mean, it varies quite a lot from street to street. In some streets, adults do play a larger role in setting up kind of more formal play activities, in setting up games, in kind of inspiring children in different ways. But in a lot of streets, it's very much a hands-off child-led model in which the parents, adults secure the space for children to play, and we then just let children play. And I think the other thing probably that's worth saying is that this is very much seen as a kind of temporary model. I mean, not only are they temporary closures, but the idea is that if this happens more and more on more and more streets in different contexts across the country and beyond, that the shift in culture means once again parents can stay in the house and that children are safe, that there is a culture of children playing out again, there is a renewed culture of children playing out, and that our streets are safer for children to play out. But we recognise that at the moment our streets are not safe for children to play out unless there are temporary adult-led closures in place, creating a space for children to play. So this is a very much kind of a philosophy of child-led play that is at the root of this model, but child-led play in spaces secured by adults.
Okay, so our next question is, do playing out sessions ever spread out to local parks and open spaces?
Yes, we've got, I mean, I think it very much depends on kind of the kind of sort of micro geography of the street and the neighbourhood. So, I mean, if there are small green spaces on streets, they are often incorporated into playing out sessions. One of the person that I organised playing out in North Tyneside with she lives in a cul-de-sac, and there's a bank and a tree, so a grassy bank and a tree, and the grassy bank and the tree are always a part of their playing out sessions. But it also creates a space then for children to continue to play out safely between sessions. So very, very local kind of green spaces like that will often be incorporated into playing out sessions and then create a safe space for children continue to play between sessions. Quite a lot of the people that I interviewed talked also about if they had adjacent larger parks, that those would then become a site where children called for each other and took each other, or families went together, families who'd got to know each other through playing out, then incorporated these larger kind of play spaces into their kind of weekly sort of play routines, and kind of, yeah, so yes.
So our next question is, what, if any, are the roles of council/local authorities in terms of facilitating or organisational, if it is community and resident led?
Well, for a start, councils have to have a model in place. They have to accept that this is something that is important and valuable and contributes in different ways to children's and family and community life. This can't happen without the support of councils. Councils in different ways, in different contexts, but in every instance, councils produce closure notices. So they do the legal work to allow streets to close. Streets can't close without legal notices and without those being approved by councils. So councils have to have a policy in place that allows residents to apply to them for a closure notice. once the council has given the closure notice, then so in a sense it's resident led, because the demand has to come from residents, but councils are essential in terms of kind of ticking the legal boxes. Some councils also provide support in terms of giving residents road closed signs, but also kind of sometimes play kit, whether it's kind of chalk or balls or skipping ropes, and sometimes high-vis jackets for stewards and stuff like that. But I guess the most important thing is that councils have to believe that this is a valid and important use for their streets, and to encourage and enable that. I mean, in a lot of instances, a lot of the work is done on the ground by voluntary organisations. That's the case in North Tyneside. We have a lot of support from the council, but as volunteers, we do an awful lot of the work, both as organisers and then at resident level. So support for those voluntary organisations from councils is also essential, whether that's financial support or moral support or organisational support. And I guess it's also probably true to say that more support is needed from councils, from councillors and from council officers when there are more kind of diverse and complex communities to work with, whether that's because of the built environment or whether that's because of the social makeup of different kind of communities, or whether it's because quite simply these places have much less of an experience of these kinds of activities in and around their streets. So there's more work to be done in some places than in others.
So this question follows on quite nicely from that one. So what about rural children who do not have the opportunity to play on the streets?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think we've begun to see the model spreading into more kind of rural contexts. In Suffolk, for example, they've been picking this up in recent years. My understanding is it's been put on hold slightly there as well because of the coronavirus crisis. I mean, sometimes people would suggest that, yeah, that in rural areas children have more space to play, but often they're not on 20 or even 30-mile-an-hour streets, and so it depends where people find themselves in rural contexts. I think there's work to be done, and I think some really interesting work to be done on how this model potentially translates to rural contexts and what might happen in those kinds of spaces. And I think that the same is also true of kind of ongoing debates around kind of cycling and walking access and how those kinds of things translate to rural communities when the focus has been so much on urban communities and on urban streets.
This next one is, I've seen people on local streets sitting out on the street on camping chairs so that they can talk to neighbours in recent weeks. Should we be making the connection between adult socialising and children play more explicit when asking for changes in response to the coronavirus?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities that are created on streets when the atmosphere changes through play on streets are enormous. And I think the benefits to adults from a much more playful and open atmosphere on streets are enormous. And I think if we can emphasise that in the debates around what happens on our streets in the coming months, then I think that would be a huge bonus for everyone.
The next one is, what is the socio-economic and ethnic diversity of the current play streets?
Yeah, another question that we get quite a lot. I mean, it is pretty diverse. I think because we see playing out happening in a whole variety of, particularly urban contexts, but in London, in Bristol, in Leeds, in Hull, in Birmingham, in a whole and in smaller towns as well. We see different kinds of places drawn into that. One of the key questions of my research as it's ongoing is trying to think about the different contexts in which playing out emerges and develops. And I think, so there's been work that's looked at this kind of model on estates, for example, in London, where it's not necessarily about the physical closure of streets, but about other ways in which we create a supportive environment for play and for outdoor play. In Birmingham, a lot of the work around playing out has been done in more disadvantaged parts of the city. Well, actually, it's interesting because there's a kind of two different kind of sets of things going on in Birmingham, but certainly in parts of the city, the focus has been very much on kind of trying to kind of create opportunities for outdoor play and for street play in more disadvantaged communities. It's difficult to kind of track some of this kind of stuff, but in the surveys that we've done so far, most people suggest that those who participate in their sessions are representative of the people who live in and around their streets, but it's quite difficult to pick that up. And I think, and it's one of the issues that I've flagged in my bigger report around kind of building connections on streets that needs much more attention.
Have children in the studies played out with children from other streets, or has this emphasised the isolation of the restricted areas?
No, I mean, most streets are open to their neighbouring streets. So on mine, for example, there's 4 or 5 streets that lead into my street, and children from all of those streets come. Often children will invite friends or family too. So grandparents, for example, often bring their children to visit on those days so that they can engage in kind of the space that's freed up. So yeah, I have no sense at all that this is something that's restricted connections between children in neighbouring streets or in kind of wider areas. That actually, yeah, that there's a, because of the space that's created, there's kind of an openness. I mean, I think at times people raise concerns about this, that if you close the street for play, won't all of the kids from the whole neighbourhood come and play on your street? And we don't really see a huge amount of evidence of that. It's not, these aren't creating kind of sort of honeypots that are drawing kind of all of the kids from the neighbourhood in, but they are drawing in kids from neighbouring streets, friends of friends, others like school friends, for example. So that it's, yeah, that these aren't exclusive kind of events. They tend to draw in people who live near and who are connected to that street, but it's reasonably open, I would think.
So we haven't got any questions left, but we've got one statement which I think is quite nice to end on. So a lot of aspects of the street and play communities can relate to neighbourhood plans and allow the use of streets in regard to uniting communities and also learning about the environment and nature. And I think that is quite a key part of this. It does unite communities. Alison, do you have anything left to say before we close the session? No,
I mean, I would wholeheartedly support that. I think, you know, in the current context, there are so many things that are opened up around, yeah, the potential to kind of connect to our communities, to connect to our environments, to connect to the people around us, and to enjoy more the time, increasing amounts of time that we're spending on our streets. And I think that that's really key. And I noticed that that Wendy Russell, who I've been working with on some of these issues over the last few weeks, has added some links to the work that we've been doing that draw particular attention to the need for street space for children to play in the coming weeks. So if any of you are involved in this on a policy level, particularly if any of you are involved in kind of the active travel plans that councils are developing, then a real call to insist that children's play is at the heart of some of those debates as well.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank Alison again, and we're going to close the session now. So